Deke Antrim, and this is my podcast, Sidetrackd. Today, I am honored to have a conversation with the smoothest man in movie history, the winner of multiple Academy Awards, the inventor of the Steadicam, the inventor of the Skycam. He's worked on such films as Rocky, Rocky II, The Shining, Marathon Man, Temple of Doom, Return of the Jedi, King of Comedy, and many, 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 many more. Garrett Brown, how are you doing today?
I'm good. I've survived that intro, so I'm really good.
Well, if you don't like being put up on a pedestal, you're going to hate the next hour.
At my height, which has always been a pain in the ass, being on a pedestal just makes it worse.
Before the Steadicam's inception, what were you watching that made you think there's got to be a way to add more movement?
I was watching my own commercials in my little film company in Philly, and I admired the smooth but very painstaking shots we've made with my ridiculously heavy dolly. I did not admire my handheld stuff, and handheld is seductive. It's so easy and so much fun. You think you're really doing something. The French New Wave, the Nouvelle Vague, those guys loved it.
Mm-hmm.
I hated the way it looked. And being, as I have often said, luckily very, very far from Hollywood, didn't seem entirely improbable that maybe there was some way to disconnect the camera from the bloke.
Even though you shot Bound for Glory before, it was Rocky that was released in theaters for audiences to see first. How much do you think Rocky's legacy in film history is owed to the Steadicam?
That's a tough one because I think that we contributed enormously to all the Rockies, including the Creeds. The fluidity and the freedom of Steadicam was very useful. And there are some shots in that film that are just heart-stoppingly great in hindsight. Riding in a van down 9th Street, the Italian market, and where somebody spontaneously tosses him an apple or an orange.
Yeah.
That shot the street's very rough, and that was one of several vehicle shots in the show. And the fact that it was dead smooth, even in a 50 mil telephoto shot, we shot two sizes. It was just extraordinary. And then, of course, the running up the steps one. I've always had a mild disappointment with that shot, and I've been talked off that ledge by everybody and his brother. The shot had some horrendous difficulties because of the cold, and my prototype had been bent, I think dropped somewhere or bent, and therefore didn't want to run in the cold. And to get it to run, I went out and got a 6-volt and a 12-volt car battery and put them in series. And poor Ralph Boda ran up the steps with me, lugging those car batteries, which was far more difficult for him than what I did. But I outran him. We outran him at the end, and the jumper cable, you might say, went taut. At the very tail end of that shot, as I'm going up and around them, the shot yaws in the roll axis. Now, it's been said, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. It's a great shot. Nobody gives a damn.
End of the day, your framing is the camera shot that's on all the t-shirts and mugs and everything else. It's an absolutely iconic shot. So.
It is, and I've almost accepted it.
For The Shining, you've said Kubrick did upwards of 30 takes on certain scenes. How do you mentally push through the pain that must have caused versus using each take as practice to master your craft?
It's entirely the latter. There, first of all, was almost no pain involved. This is a misconception that Steadicam is painful and hurts your back and so on. If your form is bad, or if you're not particularly in shape, and if you overdo it, and particularly if the form determines how easy or hard it is. If you're in form, it's just a balancing act. If you're out of form, your muscles are all tied together, and as soon as you're out of form, that force goes snaking through you and tweaks every muscle and says hello to every muscle group on the way to the ground. So it really was a piece of cake to shoot even interminable number of shots because it was broken up by a playback of equal length and then often by an argument about where the crosshairs were, whatever, which Stanley used just to slow things down so he could be a little more deliberate. So you're doing it 1/3 of the time, with the exception of the maze, which was really tough. That was a tough set, partly because it was really hot, 100 degrees in there.
That was salt, not snow, right?
Exactly. And also there's an underlying fear of death because those pine boughs were originally built up in the old MGM lot for the outside maze, and they were all struck and rebuilt and occupying an entire stage. And by then they were dry, bone dry. And just below them are 1,000-watt agricultural uplights, and then styrofoam, which we weren't able in them days to just Google what happens when styrofoam burns. But it's not pleasant, And we're in a maze, and lost, always lost. The anxiety of that, which afflicted all of us, or anybody who gave it half a thought. Mm-hmm. And of course, Stanley's voice boomed over everything. He was safe and dry inside looking at monitors. And we always had to be led out of there. They had to send people in, and somebody would find us, and with their maps in hand, lead us out. We couldn't even use a map because we didn't know where we were, except if we ended up in that central corridor in the maze, and then you could sort of find your way out. It never occurred to me, actually, to have a compass with me. That would be really good.
I don't know, man. 30 takes of anything sounds kind of tiring to me. The fact you look at it as just another opportunity to just get better and better, I find that so admirable.
Well, Deke, why is it tiring for you? How about a little therapy?
Yeah, I know. I feel like I'm on the couch now with the greatest psychiatrist for Steadicam ops of all time.
How do you feel right now, Deke? How do you feel?
I would say, honestly, after 30 takes, I'm ready to put it up.
What's your average number?
Well, I work in live television, so there's really, besides my practice, you have one chance to get it right.
God, sounds like heaven.
Yeah, compared to working with Kubrick, it probably is, yeah, for sure.
We often mentioned one of the Kubrick ones was following Shelley slowly up the 3 flights of steps.
Did you do that, Don Juan?
Don Juan, yeah. I couldn't have done it backwards. And I got pretty good. Don Juan, for listeners' purposes, is walking forward, shooting to the rear, and having your head cocked around to the side so you can sort of see the monitor, which is that ends up behind you. It's the really only practical way to run forward.
Yeah.
Because running backwards, you're so disoriented in some ways that it's dangerous. That was 35 takes going up 3 flights, which occurred to me later was the equivalent of climbing the Empire State Building at the Steadicam in one day. Each take had 6 minutes of peripherals in between, so it wasn't that bad.
Jeez.
And you know what? You may be missing the thrill. I'm not certain of this, but you might be missing the thrill that happens when you've got that number of takes. This was my master class. Mm-hmm. I would find on take 14, oh my God, if my foot's a little further this way, I can do this. And it did slowly get better up to about 20 or 30 takes.
Since the technology was so new, was there ever a time you had to tell directors like Avildsen or Kubrick no, based on what the Steadicam could or could not do?
I was an early student of the politics of lots of jobs in filmmaking. The politics of operating is just one job where politics come into play. Politics, by that I mean, how are you getting along with the chiefs, whoever you're reporting to, the rest of the crew, the producers, and the distant souls who will eventually watch the thing, right? And threading that line is quite tricky. So I learned early on not to say no. I don't think I ever said no. Mm-hmm. Enthusiasm is the great elixir for filmmaking. You cannot go wrong if you're enthused about what might happen if you do such and such. If you're enthused about basically the movie and the director and the script, your chance to be a part of it. This is a tonic for everybody. You're not making sour looks and shaking your head. So what you say is, the way to do this is this, because of course we want to avoid broken legs and stuff like that. But look, if you do this could be terrific.
So you're massaging the answer.
Yeah. And generally that prevails. By the same coin, you don't tell big egos an idea that you have. I learned early on that mostly doesn't fly, because what you're saying to them is, listen, your idea is not very good, and this is my idea, which I think is better. There's a far better way to do that, and that is, since everybody's watching in my profession from Video Village or the truck or whatever, you discover your idea. You transmute it into a discovery. You go, hey, look at this. This is cool. If I went here, look at this. And they either will yes, and more readily than if you said, why don't you go over here? If you follow me, politically, you're on the side of the angels with that deal. Likewise, don't tell famous people what to do. Tell them what your problem is. Tell them what difficulties you face, and they'll attempt to help solve it. But if you tell them what to do, that doesn't fly. There's a famous example of that. If you have time for this kind of thing.
Dude, I've got all day. It's up to you, man.
What's a typical length of one of these?
I got a 6-hour card. You do whatever you want. I'll listen to you all day.
Well, I got to go. Sorry. This has been fun. It's been lots of fun. No, in regard to that point, Larry McConkey is a famous Steadicam operator.
Mm-hmm.
He's also famously almost always an innocent and broad as he looks around and, oh, this is great. Oh, man. He's super excited about stuff, and he has an infinity of ideas and so on. Jack Nicholson loves to tweak Larry and just create difficulties for him. I guess he found that fun to watch. So Nicholson would stand in his way where Larry had to go for the shot. And if Larry was to say, Jack, could you take one step to the right? Jack would go, Larry, I'm fucking acting. Don't tell me how to act. But Larry's way too smart for him. Larry would just stop and look around like a slightly disoriented chicken. And eventually somebody would say, Larry, what's the matter? Well, I'm this wide, and he'd hold his hands out, and the space that I have to get through is this wide, and he would indicate a narrower space, and then he would just stand there looking around. And everybody would start to look at Jack, and Jack would go, well, Larry, how about if I stand over here? Jack, that's a great idea. And then he would proceed. So I hate to admit it, but that stuff at any strata, you might say, of filmmaking and video making, and while we're at it, any goddamn job in the world is a factor, unless you're Jeff Bezos, in which case you're marginally less worried about politics.
So far, we've been talking about your amount of movement in movies. I wanted to pause a second and discuss your lock-offs, especially in The Shining. They look like they're on a tripod. I'm not seeing you breathing or any kind of movements at all. Can you talk about that a little bit?
I don't know how interested your audience is in the technicalities, but they are fun to think about. It's also fun to get a little bit of insight into what's tough and what isn't.
When I say lock-offs, you would be at the end of a 5 or 6 minute take, and then Kubrick would use the tail end of the shot where you had basically just planted your camera and you were doing everything in your power to hold as still as possible so it would look like it wasn't Steadicam.
You can do that fairly easily if, number one, you land in good form, and I had to learn that on The Shining. First shot, actually, that I did was Jack walking in. The initial time he walks in and he asks for Mr. Ullman around, and the woman points in the direction and he wanders around some and then goes into Ullman's office. And by the time I got in there, I was in a very awkward position, with discs flying like frisbees, my back in S shape. And I'm waiting for cut, and there's no cut. And I can't go, Stanley! And I just toughed it out and so on. But I can tell you that every take thereafter, that requirement was met. I would land in a perfect form because I knew where the landing was and what to expect. And I also knew by then that Kubrick was using me as the master. Why? Because, as you said, it was still. But the way to do that is then, once you stop, do not look at Jack. Look at the corners of the frame and avoid breathing. And once you look at the corners of the frame, you can micromanage the frame. So if you look at the corners, you see it drift a little here and a little there. But if you're looking at the square shot ahead at Jack, you see nothing, and it looks like a tripod. If you look at Jack, there's not enough information to lock the frame because you really don't see it drifting a tiny bit. That trick stood me in good stead for 30 years after that. You can look like a tripod if you have ghost of a chance to land and keep your breathing under control and so on.
It's fantastic stuff.
Time for a commercial for Steadicam. No, never mind. We'll get to that later.
Kubrick kept you on set even when you weren't part of some of the scheduled shots. Can you elaborate on having that front row seat in filmmaking and the chance to be a fly on the wall?
Well, I did that for 6 months. I was there the whole time. And then the last 6 months, I was there week on, week off, owing to a deal that Jan Harlan, Stanley's brother-in-law and the producer of The Shining and many other of his films, made with me, because Jan, I think, pushed too hard to get me cheaply for the first 6 months. He knew I wanted to work with Stanley and told me that he couldn't pay me more than ACTT union scale, operator scale in England, which was pathetically low at the time. It was like £500 a week.
Jeez. While
he was triumphing over me in the fiduciary sense, he also gave me a rather poor per diem, stuck me in a crappy motel. And the premise was this would all be done in 6 months. Stanley was intent and Jan was intent on shooting it. All the sets are standing. All the lighting is tested on every set. We theoretically would take our little carts, which we all had, and trundle off to the next stage after we knocked off the shot in the morning, or 2 or 3 times a day we'd move. In practice, we never moved. We did one shot per day, essentially. So the 6-month deal arrived, and we were about half done. And I marched into Jan's office and I said, blah, blah, blah. I had fortunately a deal memo with this memorialized, and I said, it begins today. They had agreed to fly me by Concorde back and forth. I did 23 Concorde round trips for the next 6 months.
You were shooting Rocky 2 at the same time, right?
Yes, I went away, stone away for that, as by prearrangement for a month or so. And then this week on, week off thing happened. So for the first 6 months, yes, absolutely fascinating. I loved watching him go. It's a small crew, wonderfully coherent crew. Alcott was fantastic, the director of photography. I had one of the best assistants on the planet, Dougie Milson, who then became a DP, a very successful one. Dougie and Stanley were intent on the absolutely best, sharpest, what we call 185 Academy aperture photography. That is edge to edge within the Academy framing that left a little bit of soundtrack area, oddly, in the frame. In order to get a really sharp image within the Academy aperture, particularly within 1 to 185. That's how wide the shot is, not super wide. He required the absolute sharpest lenses that he could find and cameras that registered perfectly, meaning that the framing didn't jump around because, let's say, the pull-down pin, if it was undersized, if the gate was loose or whatever. We've all seen in the old days films that shake back and forth or move a little bit. And some of that is from shrinkage and modern projection. Some is just less rigor than Stanley Kubrick and Dougie Milson. And folks, this is the former world that I inhabited. This is the world of film and a mechanical movement that pulls the film down. A continuous speed sprocket feeds a loop, and claws go into the film as the shutter is closed and pull it down quickly and then release. And by that time, the shutter is open and we're looking at a new hunk of film. The light is exposing, right? That loop got small when the pull down claw happened. The loop builds back up as the continuous sprocket feeds it. Take up sprocket takes from the bottom loop, top and bottom. So this miracle is every bit as arcane as an internal combustion engine, which future generations will look at as its, incredible curiosity. When our electric cars, which I now want to own one, go tearing around the world with never an explosion, never a belch of hydrocarbons, you name it, right? So film is an absurdity in motion when you get down to it. A marvel, an absolute marvel, a chemical marvel, an optical marvel, a marvel that plays on our persistence of vision as humans. So we don't miss that, half the time the thing is black. Just an amazing thing. However, what you shoot is what you get. You want to hear something really arcane?
Yeah.
Stanley had Dougie perform something called a Harp Test, which had not been used regularly since maybe the 1915 or the 20s. He wanted to be sure that the lens calibrations exactly represented the actual distances from the film plane to whatever point out there in the scene, right? If you set that thing for 5 feet, well, it better be sharp at 5 feet and not 5.5 or 4.5, right? So the Harp Test, everybody would check every foot to see if that was correct. The Harp Test had a plane of focus every inch so that he could set it for 5 feet and look at the Harp Test and see that, my God, it's sharp at 411. And he would have Dougie adjust the so-called flange focal depth, which in them days was adjustable if you knew what you were doing, particularly on Ariflexes, which is the cameras that Stanley run. And the oddity is, and I can tell this story long after, the oddity was that he sent somebody out to the lumberyard to buy 1x6s, and they put together the Harp Test with layers, offset layers of 1x's, and they're all marked. What nobody realized is that lumber you buy at a lumberyard is not the exact dimension that it says. 2x4s aren't really 2 inches by 4 inches. And 1 inch thick lumber is thinner than that because of the saw blade. I don't know. So every result from the Harp Test was wrong. I did observe the elements of the Harp Test in the trash about 3 days later.
Oh, wow.
And went back to the old ways. But that's how rigorous Stanley was. I had to prove that my personal camera registered well by shooting a registration test. And then Stanley's projectors were rebuilt every other month to make certain that the projectors didn't rattle and take shape. And you know what? The results are spectacular. This photography is so brilliant, and so perfectly sharp. They would discuss things in terms that were anthropomorphic, like Dougie would say, well, this lens loves to reach into the emotion a little bit, so let's pack the depth out a little. These distigons love to reach back into the emotion. He actually adjusted the flange focal distance, but the top of that aperture in the camera had a different depth than the bottom. And the reason is that when you're looking at a set, the stuff down below is usually closer to you, and the stuff up above the frame is usually farther away. And they packed the flange focal distance so that the lens had a better depth of field throughout, from near to far. The stuff nearby was a little sharper, and the stuff far away was a little sharper than the charts would tell you. Now, you're going to get the idea that we were all supremely nerdy about this stuff. But, no more so than a surgeon, washing his hands. This is what it took at that level of filmmaking, and that was the first time I'd encountered that. Everybody else in the world, at that time anyway, was not latched on to anything quite as rigorous as that. It was amazing. And if you ever get a chance to see the traveling Stanley Kubrick
I'm dying to see
exhibit, it is sensational. And you get an insight into how, first of all, he was the hardest working filmmaker perhaps who ever lived. He did all the work on movies that never even got to be made. Napoleon, what became AI, that Steven Spielberg finished off after Stanley's death. It was a great experience for me. It came at exactly the right time. I had trained a few operators in my townhouse, made a fake shot that went from cellar to third floor and fourth floor and back down and through doors and all this. And we would make these early students sign the door frames when they banged into them with the arms, and dinged my door frames and so on. So Larry McConkie was one of them. There were a few operators that were doing this as of when I got onto The Shining, and some in the West Coast that had been impromptu trained. Immediately when I got back from The Shining, we started doing workshops and seriously teaching people, because it became clear to me that if this thing was to really succeed and spread around the world, that the key was people doing it well, and directors liking what they were getting, and audiences liking. There was nothing casual about it. And that was true. That was the beginning of 1980. We started teaching people, and I'm still doing it.
I know.
Taught thousands of people, as you know.
Mm-hmm. I did have a follow-up question about The Shining. Have you seen Dr. Sleep? And if you have, what are your thoughts on recreations of your iconic work?
I saw Dr. Sleep in a big hurry, streamed it, I think, or saw it on an airplane or something like that. And I thought it was fun.
Nice.
I liked it. Mm-hmm. It was odd to see the recreations, although the joke recreations are what give me the most joy, the humorous ones. Internet memes where they really go out of their way to make everything perfect.
Steadicam is often used because, frankly, it's the only camera that can get certain angles. With that being said, how frightening was the bridge sequence in Temple of Doom?
It was frightening and extremely difficult for a number of reasons, including the heat. It was 100 degrees and 100% humidity. This is Sri Lanka. I've heard you address this issue on other podcasts. It stands in for the great change between film and digital. Every one of my 100 or so, whatever films were, never shot a digital feature. And I never shot on a green screen. Commercials, yes, but not for feature. Mm-hmm. And of course, those two, CGI and green screen extravaganzas, go hand in hand. And let's talk about these LED walls in a bit, because that's a weird circle back toward live, right, which I kind of am interested in. But so here we are in Sri Lanka with a real rope-looking bridge. It had steel core under the rope. Among the difficulties that presented was it was really 380 feet high over a river. Of course, any number of bodies moving on it makes it gyrate up and down. So you have to keep your knees unlocked and just let your legs pump up and down and just go with it. When you're walking on it, it had gaps between the boards big enough that if your foot was sideways, your foot would go through. Harrison and all of us asked, "Is safe?" because the boards weren't all that thick. And Stephen said, "Oh yeah, no, it's safe. They're flame hardened boards." And they've all been tested. So we said, okay. And I had my own additional difficulties because, as you may know, if you've studied things like this, it's useful to have an eye line. The eye line is this direction that the actors are kind of looking at one another, let's say it over somebody's shoulder to things, or looking past you at action that you know is going to be there when you go to the reverse angle, blah, blah, blah. Not at camera, but always in one side or the other. Well, that side has to make sense, and it has to flip when you go for the reverse angle. That now they're looking the other direction, right? The eye line, or crossing the line, is one of the precious bits of film school lore.
The 180-degree line, yeah.
Yeah, stay on the same side, so you're looking over the right shoulder of an actor, and then you look over the left shoulder in the opposite direction, blah, blah, blah. Well, for me to do that, I had to make the Steadicam do something it didn't do very easily. I had to squat down on the bridge and take the arm apart and reorient the hinge. And that involved, washers and pins and screws and axles. And my assistant, terrified of dropping one down into the gorge, because we'd have been out of action. But the rig had to be outside the ropes, flying outside the hand ropes, looking across Harrison, let's say, right side toward those goons who were coming at him, blah, blah, blah. Then when we shot the reverses, we had to squat down there to the intense irritation of everybody because it took about 5 minutes. I came home, incidentally, and then quickly invented an immediate swap over for arms because who knew,
Yeah.
But the point of the story is that you'll never see a modern film build a rope bridge, let's say, like that, in a real location like that, which presents.
Yeah, and then throw the biggest Hollywood movie star in the world out in the middle of it. Yeah, that's they don't do that anymore.
Yeah, and more on that later. The CGI guys would they're just swiping ones and zeros into the universe, would say, let's make it 1,000 feet tall,
Right?
And let's make the gap between the boards 2 feet, 3 feet. And of course, you as an actor are running on faint lines on the green screen floor, so you don't give a damn how big the gap is. And the trouble with that is it immediately becomes a cartoon. This one was just within the bounds of probability, and therefore was scary as hell.
Yeah.
And it moved in ways that the word is verisimilitude. It had a degree of idiosyncrasy. It had a degree of originality in the way it moved that would be very hard for the CGI artist to dream up. So their stuff doesn't tend to be as complex as real life, at least the early stages of CGI.
It's beautiful shots. When he's coming at you and getting right in the lens like that, you can see all his sweat beating down. You can see everything. You can't get angles like that unless you're out there in the middle of it with Steadicam. It's a gorgeous, death-defying shot. I'm terrified watching that sequence every single time. It's because of your work.
It's terrifying being on it, and one of the boards break under Harrison. Did you know this story?
No.
He's running on the bridge, and a board breaks.
Oh my
And
gosh.
he went, fortunately, only one. His leg went down to the crotch, and he did not go through. And he was pissed and insisted that Stephen come on out there, and Stephen didn't like the bridge, to have a discussion about it. And we were all shut down, and they had the biggest grips jump repeatedly on all the boards, and a couple more broke from memory, and they fixed all those. And then, to give Harrison credit, there we were, back running on the bridge again. And, I'm running right after him, but I weigh 60 pounds more than he did with the Steadicam in the equation. So I was proud of him for going back and continuing, but I wasn't quite as comfortable with the idea after the board broke.
Yeah.
There's something that will, I think, go missing for a while, at least in our CGI digital universe, until the art gets so good and actors are able to so reimagine things that in the CGI bridge they can come running up to the camera and still have that unmistakable tension and adrenaline flowing that accompanies the real thing.
That's probably my favorite sequence in the entire movie. And again, it just has everything to do with the fact that you are able to get a camera within inches of Harrison's face. You can feel he's got the pressure coming from the left, the right, not knowing what to do. It's a fantastic sequence. I love it. And obviously legendary for sure.
Can I offer you another one?
Of course. Don't twist my arm here.
It impressed the hell out of me and still does. In Raiders, which I foolishly turned down, I was asked to go shoot Raiders, and for reasons that I won't go into to explain my idiocy, I said no, which was irritating, I think, to Stephen. I offered him another operator, but who did one or two shots, reasonably well, but not well enough to end up being used the way Stanley used me. And I think if I had been there, I would have been useful for the whole film. But I went to see it with my young son and was just beating myself up for not being a part of that. And what excuse did I have for not doing that fabulous film? We loved it. But there's a scene in it where a Nazi guy gets into a fist fight with him, a bald Nazi, big, muscly guy. And
airplane tarmac?
Yeah, exactly. And it's a beautiful sequence. And herself, who I like enormously, is up in the cockpit trying to get the machine gun to work and so on. And this guy puts his dukes up, the Nazi guy, and Harrison puts his dukes up. And he lands a shot that knocks Harrison back down on his ass in the sand. You remember it?
Oh, yeah.
And if you look at that sequence frame by frame compared to the ridiculous CGI fights that we've looked at, the Green Goblin actually flies and falls faster than gravity.
Right.
People slam into things like they're made of rubber and regularly increase the speed of falling. But this is a real 240-pound guy in a real hot place, landing in real dust, not CGI dust.
Yeah.
And landing in a way that causes his flesh to make ripples that race down his pant leg and back up almost, and that is every part of him ripples under his clothing and sags instantaneously and recovers. And it's so visceral, it's so real. There's not yet a good digital way to achieve that. And that that's a real guy falling, and now compare this to Kong, let's say, the Peter Jackson Kong. Kong is supposed to weigh 5, 6, 7 tons. Kong is supposed to be huge. Well, the cube law is why elephants' legs are that thick and why they move as slowly as they do. Because your mass goes up by the cube of what your mass would be with the smaller dimensions, right? And yet, Peter Jackson has Kong bounding around like a chimpanzee.
Yeah.
And the film is riddled with places where Fay Ray would have been pulled 40 G's and would have been turned to jelly, as he's swinging her around, stamping the ground with her in his hand. And as he's bounding toward the Empire State Building, he is moving like a creature who might weigh 300 to 400 pounds, not 7 tons. And what occurred to me was, if they had gotten that right, the ponderous, thudding motions of that, the motion of Kong's flesh under his fur, the thuds that would shake a taxi down to its tires as he approached, would have been so thrilling to watch and far more impressive. So, we're the audience, and the stuff that's really impressive sometimes is the stuff that's the most real. Would you agree?
No, absolutely.
I mean, at its best, CGI is thrilling. I love Gladiator. I love peering at Rome, recreated. But there were things in that film that one of the, as you may know, the second assistant directors are often in charge of how crowds behave. And if they're crowds of extras, they will often say, whose birthday is in February? And a certain number of hands, and average 1 in 12 goes up. And he says, okay, you are the only people allowed to move or do anything. The rest of you just sit there and look. Because that's what a real crowd does. Not, 10 out of 12 are just sitting there. And 1 or 2 are actually looking at their neighbor or talking or looking down or wiping their nose or whatever. Extras all want to be seen. They all want to make their career, and left unregulated, an audience of extras, every one of them will be furiously doing business, looking at one another and talking and chattering away and moving and, scratching themselves and everything they can to do exactly what they don't want, which is draw attention to it. And the digital extras in Gladiator, in the stands at the Coliseum, needed a digital AD. Okay, whose digital birthday is January?
Right.
The rest of you digital creatures. But they couldn't bear for their creations to sit still. And so they're all seeding away and doing business. It's very funny.
Those are algorithm birthdays. That's what those are.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Isn't it amazing?
Yeah.
We may all be algorithms.
Yeah, and yeah, that's the sad fact right there. Yeah, every time they come out with a new piece of equipment, I'm like, man, I'm going to be out of a job here soon. This is unbelievable.
I thought that about drones ever since
Yeah.
they came out. When will drones put the Skycam on the sideline? I don't know, not immediately because they're not there yet and they can't do what the Skycam does, but I'm watching.
You did mention Skycam. I was going to ask you, can you talk a little bit about your Skycam work on the movie Highlander?
Do you know this story, by the way? Does your homework include the answer to this question?
No.
Do you know what I'm about to say?
No.
It was a very discouraging experience in the end. We made a wonderful shot to Russell Mulcahy's direction in an arena up in New Jersey, flying around up in the rafters and then swooping over the ring and then flying up to find Chris Lampere sitting well back from the railing way up in the nosebleed section. And we liked it. It was painstaking to do. Skycam, my little company, was in huge trouble because we had spent all the dough and only had one Skycam. I couldn't keep the factory open with the rentals, even at $25 grand a day from one machine, and we didn't have the capital to build more. It was a tough situation, and this job was a lifeline, and we did a brilliant job. And then the producers, Panzer and Davis, notified us that they weren't paying us.
Whoa.
And I said, why? What are you talking about? And the producer said, that's not the shot that I wanted. I said, well, you weren't there. We worked for Russell. We did what Russell asked for. He said that he wanted it. Well, I'm not paying you. These are sociopathic creatures, and some of them in every business. So I said, you can't be serious. And we had an argument, and he hung up.
Wow.
And so I happened to know Joey B at Technicolor, and I told him what happened. And he was so outraged that he held their dailies and wouldn't release the negative.
Wow, I did not know that.
They were headed. No, it's really, really unknown. And they were headed for England. And a judge in New York intervened and said, no, you can't, without an injunction, you can't hold their negative here. You need to sue them in England, which was not very good news. So I sued them in England and eventually won. But the sad fact was we only got about 50 cents on the dollar.
Oh, man.
You are not prepared when you're a knight on the good side of things, as we consider ourselves, innovating, doing amazing shots. You are not prepared for that kind of behavior. And yet some of it happens at every end of society. So I was shocked by that, profoundly shocked.
I think I saw that movie, at 11. Even as a kid, I remember they have a camera flying around inside of a stadium. Like, how did they do that? It's a fantastic shot. It's one of the greatest introductions to a character. To hear that story, that kind of sours it a bit. That sucks.
It is disappointing, and I'm sorry, it's a sour note. They wanted us to fly back up to where Chris was, 20 feet back from the railing. The wires would have hit something. I couldn't get right up to him, so we had to fly there, and they lit a flash bulb to cover the cut, and then they cut to a camera that from the same position zoomed in on. It worked great. Seamless, if you will. Yeah.
No, it's a bummer.
No, I'm thoroughly bummed.
Yeah, I was about to say, sorry I brought it up.
Drinking heavily. Yeah.
Oh, God. I do not want to be responsible for that. The next question I had was about aspect ratios. You had talked about this earlier. The Shining was shot at 185:1, but released in Europe at 166:1, versus Temple of Doom, which was shot at 239:1. Do you have a preference, shooting more vertical or shooting more scope?
The Shining was actually shot at 185:1. He deliberately didn't do it anamorphic because it didn't really fit those sets. It wasn't shot 4:3, which is what One from the Heart was shot in. A true nostalgic exercise. But 166 was an oddball. My memory is that it was Academy, which is 1 to 185.
Yeah.
Within the Academy aperture, which gives away some of the actual soundtrack area. Fascinating area, which is back in consideration because some of the new digital cameras will natively shoot nearly 2:1, 235:1, the wide apertures with lots of extra pixels top and bottom. We're into such a strange and wonderful area. If you don't use all the pixels possible, then you are in place to make some moves in post-production, to reframe. If you have super excess of resolution, you're in shape to zoom in on the final thing and make moves that are purely optical, which it has to be said in the movie world, that in the film world, as soon as you start into opticals, the quality is degraded because it's, quote, generations, which don't exist in digital. Every copy is exactly the same as the original digital, which I applaud. Stanley rigorously avoided any extra generations and was very cautious when he did them. He would often, notoriously, for example, in 2001, he shot the exterior surroundings of that great lunar crater scene from a model. And then he refrigerated the negative for a year till they got around to resetting what was happening inside that. And he exposed that same negative, the missing bit that had not been exposed, masking off the outer stuff and now opening up, unmasking the center, and put the exact same original negative in the camera after a great length of time. And it's flawless. And it means that that scene that has one matte painting or coexistent with a new live action photography in the middle without the loss of a generation. And 2001 was full of tricks like that.
Yeah.
Really extraordinary stuff.
Yeah, I just didn't know if you had a preference to shooting more scope or a little more vertical.
Well, it depends on the subject. Vittorio Storaro is a huge fan of 2-to-1, which is not as extreme as 2-3-5-to-1. I've shot all those formats. In our particular era, we had a tiny little green screen monitor. By the time you're shooting widescreen with an anamorphic lens, you have to simulate the actual frame on the little monitor, and what you're looking at is the size of a Band-Aid. And it's really hard to frame for headroom in tiny little creatures that are moving around within that Band-Aid size green and black and white picture. I would make it arbitrarily tall just so that I could try to eliminate the headroom and have a chance at it. Now we have supremely good color monitors and we can see everything that's happening.
Yeah, with focus assist and everything. It's
well, in my day, we couldn't see anything.
Movies you've shot like Marathon Man wouldn't be the same without Steadicam. Can you touch on being so essential to the visual language of a production that you're practically one of the stars of the film?
Well, sometimes that happened very organically. Those films would have been made perfectly well if I hadn't come along. Even The Shining, although I could tell you some very funny stories about how they tried to get smooth shots in those corridors. I show up with this new trick, they take advantage of it, and it becomes an important part of the movie. Dustin running around the reservoir and me on a golf cart next to him, even telephoto. It was not possible to make shots that smooth, and the smoothness contributed to the tension. As you may know, I'm not a fan of handheld, partly because I now understand that what makes smooth shots so appealing is because that's the way we see the world. When you run, you're seeing, in effect, the Steadicam shot. Your world does not bounce around, and if it did, you would be eaten by a predator as we're evolving into human beings.
Right.
If your vision looked like handheld, you'd never catch your lunch, or you'd immediately be consumed by something. Can you imagine, start running and you can't resolve it? Evolution provided a connection between your inner ear, the muscles that control your eyes. And if you at home want to try an experiment, look at something across the room, move your heads up and down, and fix your eyes on something across the room. Dead study. Now look at that same thing across the room and shake your head side to side. No shaking.
Mm-hmm.
Now here's the telling one. Tilt your head sideways. The room does not tilt.
I'm doing it as you're telling me, so.
Yeah, I hope everybody.
Yeah.
Your brain is furiously processing this stuff. When you walk, you don't even see yourself move up and down and sideways, which is what's actually happening when you're walking, because the brain is uninterested in that. It's not information that helps survival. We're seeing a very highly processed image. Forget CGI and digital. We're seeing much processing as in an iPhone. And it's extremely important, but the result is that's the way your whole lifelong movie has been viewed by you from birth. Everywhere you go has been stable. And your horizon never tilts. Even when you lie sideways, there's no question that the horizon is what it is. It doesn't come with you when you lie sideways. And so that, to me, is why handheld is so disappointing. Not only is it shaky, because, of course, you're holding the skin of the camera. Every move you make is a tangent. It's not only shaking in the angular sense, up and down, side to side, it's shaking in the roll axis. It's jerkily off level. So, yeah, if you watch a Lars von Trier movie, It's intensely irritating for the first few minutes, and then I confess I get used to it, but I never liked it. That's another processing thing. You can get used to anything, but it doesn't make it a virtue. I've talked so much on this, I forgot what your question was.
No, it's okay. It's fine. No, actually, I loved hearing all that stuff, so it's fine.
Oh, marathon.
Yeah, marathon, man. Go ahead.
Yeah. So I show up, I have this trick, they use it. It was fantastic.
King of Comedy is one of my all-time favorite dark comedies. The New York City shots look super run and gun. How different was it shooting in those conditions?
It was great fun, but they were a little fast and loose. They didn't own those sidewalks.
I was about to say, they didn't look like they had permits when you guys were shooting.
No, they may have had permits, but they didn't own the sidewalk, and those weren't extras. I shot a lot of stuff that I loved on that film, but I had told them that it wasn't a good idea to run with the Steadicam BL, which is a very heavy, silent camera. And they came up with a impromptu running shot on the sidewalk, which I think might have been on 57th Street approaching 7th Avenue. And I agreed to do it because you want to be a nice guy. And it was Jerry Lewis, who had just had an open heart surgery and wanted to prove that he was back and fast. And he was trying to beat me, he was running beside me at a great rate. I'm looking sideways, running. My view ahead is over the camera with me bounding up and down. The camera's still in front of me and looking at the screen, and yeah, he's in frame, and it's okay, he's in frame. I noticed there's a guy standing directly in my path, and we're approaching, how your brain is processing. In Steadicam, as you know, your attention cycles between things. You can't look at one thing exclusively. It was, yes, he's still in the frame, it's still level. The guy is still in front of me. It's still in frame. It's level. The guy's still in front of me. He's in frame. It's level. Jesus. Oh, there's a grip moving the guy. The grip did not move the hydrant that he was standing in front of. Hidden from me. And I ran smack into the hydrant.
I don't know why I'm laughing.
And tilted forward and saved myself by putting the Steadicam and the BL smack into the pavement at full speed, smashing the lens and the camera, knocking the lens off the camera, tearing my pants and ripping my leg, complete mess. They had the shot. That was it for me. I was wrapped for the day. It was my last shot anyway. And I had arranged to go to dinner with somebody, and there I am going to dinner with a ripped pant leg and blood, dried blood down the front of my leg. It's a sign of a couple of things. This job is much better organized now. People know what to do. They know what's possible. They know what to ask you to do. There are unwritten laws about how this job is done. And there's also a great deal more grip involvement in safety and a more sensible scouting and being sure stuff like this doesn't happen, which politically you can perfectly easily do when people honor that. But I was out at the very beginning of all this, and there were no rules. What was possible was what I did. There's a film called Wolfen, which is worth a look, Wolfen. We did unbelievable stuff on that film that had never, ever been done before. I was a wolf, like a super large, man-eating, pretty nasty wolf's point of view in so-called low mode, bounding over things, shooting at 12 frames so that this wolf was tearing along. And I, at one point, running across a field of rubble. It wasn't real rubble, it was movie rubble brought in for this job. The movie rubble included evidently a loop of wire from a concrete block, and my foot went into the loop of wire, and I was lassoed at a dead run and just brought down like somebody would rope a steer. And another one, smash everything. I had knee pads on, still missed it.
Oh, man.
So part of that is what you get with a new machine whose soul hasn't been regulated yet. It's still being discovered.
Sequels often feel the need to outdo their predecessors. Did you go into Rocky II with a desire to create something better than your previous work?
No. I was fresh off The Shining, on leave from really regretting that I had to leave. It was a great experience, Rocky II. It was fun to see Sly, and I met some people who have been lifelong pals. And my son was in it as one of the kids who went charging along and ran up the Art Museum steps.
Oh, cool.
I was better at all of it. I didn't need 2 car batteries for Rocky II, which was really, really delightful. My skills were supremely good. One funny thing is at the top of the steps the first time Stallone said, Garrett, we can't keep on meeting this way, And yet we did.
Right.
It just kept going. Stallone was in the same mode in Rocky One that I was. A brand new trick, a brand new chance, a spectacular script. No money, because when he insisted on starring in it, they killed the budget. We had one motorhome. That's how tiny this production was. He sat in the middle of it, and they catered in the front of it. It was cold, and the overflowing bathroom was at the back of the thing, a dreary old Winnebago. First time I met him, actually, he was sitting there in his gray sweats. I was thinking about using his bathroom, and I'd heard that it was terrible. I said to him, knowing who he was, I said, "Is it working?" pointing to the bathroom. And he said the following: "Well, you don't sling any iron in there, you'll be all right." And I thought, oh my God, this guy is amazing. What a colorful, he's fantastic. What a line. I love Stallone. He's a fabulous character. And that script, talk about yanking yourself up by your bootstraps. That's the way to do it.
What was the last camera shot that stumped you, or you couldn't figure out how it was done?
I don't think anybody can quite honestly say that they know how some of today's wild, wacky composite shots are done. Exactly. They know that something is really impressive. And of course, these poor guys have to outdo themselves every new film. It has to be more impressive, we weren't in that condition in analog film era. Quality was a better story and it would grip you for some way, but it wasn't specifically, in most cases, related to special effects and so on. It was the human stuff, which of course always trumps any, if I may use that word, any phenomenon. Even on Lord of the Rings, the first one, that spiraling flying shot following the black birds down into the Forge of Charon or whatever it's called, which they evidently worked on for 3 months, the CGI folks, to have all the stuff you saw on the way down there. And then at the bottom, Chris Lee, I think, and they have a fake cut, and there you are in front of him. And when he opens his mouth, says one line, it's more riveting than all that digital stuff. Good acting is still the best thing out there.
Not so much like CGI shots. We were talking about Dr. Sleep a little earlier, and I know Mike Flanagan, he did The Haunting of Hill House, and there was almost an entire episode that was hour long, which, again, you couldn't do back in the film days, but they have an entire episode that's done in one single shot. And just stuff like that. I've heard you talk about the True Detective Steadicam shot in season 1 that blew everyone's mind away. Is there any shots like that just you watch as the creator of the Steadicam and to see this instrument that you created almost 50 years ago go on to do these shots? Are there any shots now? Are there any operators that are just kind of blowing your mind?
There are tons of them, and it's very gratifying. But I confess, I get into watching a movie and I'm not aware of a Steadicam shot or even thinking about technicalities. And Ellen will give me an elbow in the middle of a great shot. And then I realize, this is Steadicam. God, it's good. I see them all the time. Just astounding work. When you think about it, improbably, this thing is still out there, still expanding, because we have a new invention called the Volt, which takes away some of the irritating housekeeping aspects of Steadicam off there and keeps it level for you. It lets you work neutral balance.
It's the love child of Steadicam and gimbal.
Yeah, it's Steadicam, and, well, not really, because it's done way differently than a gimbal, but it's just clever as hell. And I shouldn't say that because I'm on the patent, but it has completely taken over, and everybody in the world doing Steadicam wants this thing for good reason, because it frees up a sizable chunk of your brain that used to have to be keeping it level, and it allows your entire will and shot-making abilities to concentrate on content. That is fabulous. So this stuff is still getting better, and every now and then when I'm thinking about it, I can spot shots that are very likely made with a Volt. A lot of the stuff in the Olympics is in that category. Some just astonishing shots where you can tell they're really up against it physically, trying to keep it together and get a shot. And the shots are perfect. And that final little bit of perfection is probably attributed to the Volt. As it happens, I'm in the Sports Broadcasting Hall of Fame, and I don't even particularly like sports. I just like shots.
Yeah.
I like great sports photography. But I will drive my fellow inductees crazy if they're talking football. I'll go, remind me, what's the shape of the ball for that? What is that, the round one, or is that the oval one? Joking, obviously, but what counts for me is the shot. That's why I love Skycam. A great Skycam shot is just just supremely great. And when you get down to it, the thing about Steadicam, as opposed to conventional operating in the old days, which was essentially panning and tilting and maybe talking to your dolly grip about this move and stop and so on and jib and blah, blah, blah. In Steadicam, you are panning and tilting and you have feet. And therefore, you are panning and tilting and moving and approaching and weaving and doing French curve moves that would drive a dolly grip crazy. And yet, you are putting the lens where it pays off the most, second by microsecond. And the impressive thing about that is you're an auteur of motion, both 3 degrees of physical motion, in, out, side to side, up and down, and panning and tilting. And it's all controlled by one brain. And the most impressive thing about these shots often is the way they start and the way they stop, the acceleration curve, the exact particulars that cause operating, in my view, to be one of the seminal movie-making skills. Mm-hmm. You have the audience's eyeballs in your midst, and you are placing their eyes, and that is fabulous.
I love that.
Help yourself to end the podcast with that.
I was about to say, that's a good way to end. You've been so instrumental to how people view films, television, and sports. When are we getting a Garrett Brown statue at the bottom of the Philadelphia Museum of Art steps?
Never. I hope. I am an amateur student of certainly of fame and of even celebrity, which is quite different. I don't want to be busted on the street. I have the ideal situation of, in a trade show of film gear people, I don't wear a name tag. I'm stopped too often. But if I don't wear a name tag, I'm invisible. Having watched what happens to people who thought they wanted to be famous and appalled by the consequences. No thanks. I want to work in the weeds and do fun stuff.
Thank you for revolutionizing movement in movies and television. I want to thank you for dedicating the second half of your career to selflessly teaching your craft to the next generation of Steadicam operators. And as a Pennsylvania native, I want to thank you for the many locations you've made so famous. Garrett, it's been an absolute honor to chat with you and listen to your story, sir. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Deke. Take care of yourself.
Thank you once again to our amazing guest, Garrett Brown. This was definitely one of the most educational conversations I've ever had in my entire life, and I will forever be grateful to Garrett for that. I want to thank the show's producer, Gigi Lage, who handles most of the hard work here on the podcast, and a special shout out to our good friend Jay Kilroy, who helped put this program together for us. If you like what you heard on today's show, feel free to subscribe and follow us on all your favorite podcatchers, and keep up to date with what we're doing on our social media platforms like Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, or our official website, sidetrackd.stream. Thanks so much for listening. We love you all, and until next time, stay sick.